Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Jamie McHugh. So Jamie is extremely experienced somatic movement specialist, multidisciplinary artist and photographer, coming at us from California, where I know a lot of our listeners are. He's been doing this for a while, since before I was born, in fact, according to his website there. He's worked with all sorts of people, from AIDS patients in universities. He's also got all sorts of teachers that are well known, people like Marjorie Bristow, Lee Conrad, Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. So someone that's super experienced in this work. So Jamie, you are super welcome on the show today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So back in time, how did you get interested in the body? Yes. What was your way in?
Where to begin in space and time with that question? But to really simplify it, I'll say it really, my body epiphany came when I went away to university. I got to university and I was prepared to go to university my whole life. And I got there and I thought, I don't know what I'm doing here. So I took a year off to get state residency to make it much, more affordable to go to school. And in that year, I did a lot of reading. I worked at a hotel as a front desk clerk. And at the end of that year, of basically, I had begun transcendental meditation the year before. I had started, looking at my diet, my activity level. And at the end of that year, I decided to ride my bicycle back to Washington, D.C., where I'd be working at a camp for blind kids. And because I took that journey, and really it was like a rite of passage, kind of a self-styled rite of passage that I didn't realize at the time. For me, it was just a journey. But being in the movement of riding my bike each day and just being free and open in space and singing sometimes, I just really committed myself to that experience, and along the way met a lot of wonderful people. And it not only affirmed my place in the world, but it really affirmed for me that, people at heart are really lovely. And that was a big learning and a leap for me. And so to kind of speed ahead, when I got back, I realized I needed a physical practice because I was going back to study. I was studying English. I was an English major. And a friend of mine was in a women's self-defense class, and she said, well, it's always great to have a few guys in the class because, you don't want to freeze up when you're on the street. And so it was traditional karate. So we did, the katas, the warm-ups, the forms. But on Friday, so this is in the 70s, right? It's the disco years. So our teacher would bring in disco music on Friday, and we would do the katas to disco music. And all of a sudden, all of a sudden, the music made the movement come alive. And it was in that I realized, oh, I don't want to do karate. I just want to move. I love this lightness of being. And around that time, I was working part-time in a facility for developmentally disabled adults. And I realized that play was the thing that kind of made what I'd call their, on the surface, dreary institutional lives much more interesting. They were trained to be good, productive citizens of society, to work at Goodwill during the day, to learn grooming and this and that, which is all, we all need that functionally. But when they came home to the institution in the evening, they would, go down, eat the institutional food, come up, sit around the day room, smoke cigarettes, and watch TV. And ultimately, there would be a fight, a disturbance. We'd have to, kind of do a lockdown. Some people would be given meds. I mean, the whole 9 yards. And that's when I realized this thought, if I was there, if this was my life, I would probably be, quite aggressive myself too. So it's like, what can I do to change who we are as a community? So I just, in my naive way, I thought, well, let's bake banana bread one night, or let's make tie-dye t-shirts, or let's take a walk, sign out a van and take a walk in the park. And what happened is the conflict level dropped. We had a shared activity. And sometimes I would harness a few of my friends to take a few of the residents out to a bar on Friday night and go dancing. And we were quite the motley crew coming in, some of the residents who had severe epilepsy had, football helmets on, and are kind of walking very unstable. So people are like checking us out. And so we started dancing, and it was really those kind of experiences. And I kind of laid the groundwork in this way is I realized, it really boils down to the simplicity of contact, connection, generating more life force. And so that's when I decided that I was going to start dancing.
Nice. Okay, let's.
I know. We're on a time frame, but
no, it's good. Actually, it's nice to hear a personal story. So, Jamie, you're doing this dancing with this motley crew, as you call it, and what came next in terms of embodied practices? Because I know you've done quite a few things. So, it sounded like from that point, just this whole world opened up to you.
Well, it was. Well, excuse me. I was fortunate in that when I was going to school part-time, and some friends of mine said, there's a great dance improvisation class, and I needed another credit. And I thought, great. And for me, it was very fortuitous to take this class with a graduate student named Barbara Bruce, who at some point, I knew nothing about dance. I was just, kind of excited to be there because I used to write poetry. I was actually went to university as a creative writer. And that was my kind of strategy for staying sane in high school. And the moment I walked into dance improv, I realized, this is like creative writing, but through the body. And it was so excited to me that, and because of my experiences working not only with the developmentally disabled adults, but also I was also working part-time at a preschool, I thought, this is what I want to focus and follow. This idea of the moving, expressive body and the sensate satisfaction that comes through with that. And I was very fortunate that I came to dance that way. I think if I had gone to a technique class, forget it, right? It was more that this idea that dance really was for liberation and freedom. And for me, that was a very important theme in my life at that time, and still is to a point.
It strikes me as strange almost that we have one word, dance, that covers different aims and different methods, right? Like something like a freeform dance where the purpose is creative expression. It's quite different from a performative dance or a romantic dance, or, there's different purposes and different methods that follow as a result, all under this kind of one word dance, which is sort of the Western world seems to have given to kind of any kind of movement which isn't just purely locomotive.
Right. And, it's, and I think that's why for many years I shied away, I'd say in the last 20 years, shied away from calling myself a dancer because it conjures up so many different things for people, or to say that what we're going to do is dance, it's like, people kind of freak out a bit around that word because we have a model of performance that inhibits participation. Talk about like really magnifying people's inhibitions by saying, okay, now we're going to dance,
Right.
So anyway, so that, really a template was set in my mind, which is, that improvisation opened the door to this idea that dance is for everybody to be the choreographer of their own lives. That if you look at dance as performance, in a sense, it's kind of regressive politically. It's quite authoritarian. And especially back in those days, in the 70s, there's still really just a lot of, it's changed a lot in terms of there's been more collectives and people working together. But back in those days, it was still pretty much that, if you were the choreographer, you had the power. So little by little, that kind of guided me into working in public schools, doing creative dance and drama and creating improvisational performances with the students. And, that over time, I was thinking, well, schools become like these islands of where, the kids are separate from the community, from their parents, and it's not very welcoming. And so how can we involve everybody in the dance? And so I started making these all school festivals in my artist residencies of bringing in the community to dance together. And, that was like really exciting to me. And I had discovered Laban movement choirs. So I was doing my own version of Laban movement choirs. The largest I did was with 300 children on a.
Do you want to say what a Laban movement? I mean, I know who Laban is, but what's a movement choir?
Oh, okay. So Rudolf Laban worked with, in his analysis of movement and, kind of movement motifs, he created this idea that all these different guilds in Germany could, in a sense, create a specific movement phrase, and then they would all come together in these large stadiums and move together. And so it's just, if you really think of, for me, it's kind of like a Western version of indigenous dance. I mean, in indigenous dance, in my experience of it, you have a very basic, simple motif that is repeated and repeated over and over again so that you can experience the large collective body, right? The individual I becomes part of this moving body because, the movement is very simple, right? So you don't have to think, you don't have to plan, you don't have to, you just know it, you just do it. And he did, in a sense, a similar thing by creating these components, and then everybody would come together and move together, which if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, but I think they sometimes had up to 10,000 people coming together and moving.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's pretty big. It seemed to be a theme in Germany at that time. I'm guessing this Laban was pretty different from the other sort of big groups of Germans from the 1930s we may have seen moving in collective union. But,
well, and he has quite a controversial reputation. I mean, I know different scholars have talked about it. In fact, it'd be great for you to interview Karen Bradley sometime, who's a Laban scholar. But I guess Hitler tapped him for the Olympics. And when a German official came and saw what they were doing, told Laban, there's too much individuality in this, you've got to change it. And I guess that's when he fled Germany.
Yeah, because I know he had to run away in the end. Okay.
I don't have the whole historical story, but yeah.
So Laban, community dance, Laban choirs, what else?
Movement choirs. And so from there, because I was starting to do this large scale work, I heard more and more about Anna Helprin's work with city dance and large scale group rituals. And I thought, oh, I want to check this out. And so I did a summer workshop with her in Boulder, Colorado in 1985. And that's when I caught the fire that, oh, this is the woman who really knows something about movement and community movement in particular. Mm. And coming from the world of dance where, the premium is on, how complicated can you make your movement, how quick, how fast, how high can you get that leg, et cetera, right? A lot of activity going on. What I found so refreshing in her work is in the workshop, she started with us just walking. And as you're walking, paying attention to, how you're walking and the arms swinging, and then to highlight, for example, the rotation of the pelvis, or then to look around to be aware of the common pulse in the room. And the simplicity of that movement for me was so refreshing. It's like, oh, I can just settle into this basic movement. At the same time, I can see my surroundings. I can see the people around me. I can make connection. It was like a veil was taken off, and all of a sudden I could be present in myself, in the movement, in the room, right? So that was really an epiphany for me about this is what I want, how to make movement and embodiment so accessible, not only to myself, but to all the people I work with. And I'd say that's been the general mandate of my work over the years.
And like bringing it right out to date, like what's most alive for you in movement work now?
So, one of the things, I live rurally and I love it, but of course there's a trade-off when you live rurally. There's just not a lot of people around. And so I've had to adapt. And one of the things I discovered out of necessity is teaching online. And so what I'm excited about now is teaching contemplative practice through the virtual world. And for me, it's actually making me really shift the way I teach a class. And at the same time, that creative challenge is exciting, because I do see this as kind of a new iteration of how we connect as we are connecting in the world.
Yes.
And so it's like really taking somatic principles, and that in my work, I've distilled a lot of things down to what I call the basic 5, which is that if you look at all the various bodies of somatic work, what is kind of common, there throughout is the 5, which are breath, vocalization, movement, contact, and stillness. And if you really, think about it, right? It's like breathing permeates everything. It's the origins,
yes,
of life here on the planet, and when we exit, right? I mean, and how we can relate to our breath, how we can explore it. And, I think, for example, if we know 20 different ways to breathe, we have a lot of flexibility in our system. And what is vocalization? Vocalization is simply bringing the breath into sound, out into space. And of course, because of the vibration of the vocal cords and the resonance in the body, vocalization takes us into a very different realm than just breathing alone.
Yes.
And then,
sorry, after you. Complete.
Okay. And so contact, contact. What happens when we start, first of all, with ourself, all the different ways we can use touch to animate and amplify sensation. And, touch is our most basic language when we are infants. When we first come into this world, is how we learn movement, is through touch and interaction. So how to reclaim our own bodies with these different forms of touch. That, of course, leads into movement. I mean, for me, movement in the 5 is, from the very simple to, rising and sinking, advancing, retreating, expanding, condensing, to, rocking, crawling, rolling. And of course, developmental movement patterns and, the basics, you don't have to get into all the intricate details of developmental movement, but essentially, this is how life unfolded for every human animal on this planet. It takes different shapes and forms according to culture, but this is how we started off. And then finally, stillness. Stillness for me is this place of, it's like the pause in between the inhale and the exhale, It's the period at the end of the sentence. Micro stillness all the way to longer and longer periods of stillness is kind of I would say, really the emerging technology that we're all, in a sense, needing more and more these days, but also learning to expand our definition of what that is. So it's like the stillness of reflection and repose rather than the stillness of fear.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Frozenness.
So, anyway, so taking those 5 for me, it's like translating it into practices, contemplative practices of where people can inhabit their bodies really simply. Because I'd say my bottom line is it's actually very easy to be a body. We can get involved in all of these ideas and grand expeditions and this and that and the other thing. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, what is your practice? What do you do for yourself as a human animal each day to give yourself more freedom, space, comfort, and ease?
Yeah,
I would say that's yeah.
I like these short lists. You know, in Systema they have posture, breathing, movement, and relaxation. It's just 4 things, and they say it's all about that. And we have 8 on my course. We say, okay, 8 basic tools to work with. And you know, I like these from a couple of angles. Like, one is it keeps it really simple. It's like, okay, what are we working with? Breath. Okay, contact. Okay, great. Keep it simple. And then the other one is to sort of, as an embodiment practitioner, to go, okay, where do I have skill and where do I lack skill? Like when I was researching you, I came across this list and I went, okay, 4 of those I have some real training in, and vocalization, wow, that's kind of a weak spot for me. Maybe I could really develop myself as a trainer through looking at vocalization a bit more, you know? And so for me, there's a few ways in which these short lists are helpful. And I almost wonder if the embodiment world, as all these different systems come together, like you've studied Alexander, you know, you've studied body mind centering, continuum. We're almost like where science was in the 17th century. We're sort of looking for our atoms. We're looking for our grammar.
Right.
We're going, what are the basic building blocks of somatic training? And you know, that basic 5 certainly is as good a list as any I've heard.
Thank you. Well, you know, it's funny because I like to sometimes say, I think of these as the stem cells of, in a sense, movement and embodiment practice, right? We if you think of stem cells, they're undifferentiated, they're kind of open-ended, and then they, in a sense, specialize and become something, right? And so I like to see these kind of foundational things being a springboard for all kinds of applications in kind of the movement arts, and quite honestly, it is really these basics that have altered my consciousness as a sensate body and has really contributed to how I make art. You know, very often people say to me, well, oh boy, I'd love it if you could teach, you know, a photography class. And I was like, well, I don't really know how to do that. I can teach you some skills for how to drop down, how to focus, how to, in a sense, suspend time and enter these states of being. For me, that's how I create art. I can't teach you technique, but I can teach you these entrance points into your somatic experience. So, but yeah, so I really see these as the stem cells, and you know, and when you begin to combine them, so, you know, you could start with breath and contact, so you're tracking breath, and then that becomes a sound, which then stimulates movement, and then with moments of stillness. So for me, these 5 are kind of separated out for, in a sense, teaching purposes, but then orchestrating them and bringing them all together. And for me, it's, you know, when I kind of go into that zone of just combining, letting one thing lead into the next, it's like I lose, what would I say? I would say I'd lose the ordinary boundaries of myself and can experience something very different. And for me, I would say that really comes back to an idea of Moshe Feldenkrais's, which is when we step out of our habits, when we begin to experiment and allow something new to happen, we are generating these new neural pathways that allow for more flexibility and choice in the system. And I'd say that's really a great model for the body politic these days, as we become more entrenched in positions and fundamentalism and really creating much more separation instead of, I'd say, more universal, inclusive empathy. And that's, for me, that really starts in the body. And if anything, my hope is that in my work, and that, it's my personal mission, but that I hope that in teaching this work, that I give people the experiences of really tuning into settling, feeling more at home, and in feeling more at home, how to evoke a generosity of spirit and connection with others. I mean, that's really, for me, the bottom line.
Lovely, Jamie. And several of our guests in the last year or two, should we say, have talked about this idea of the body politic and the kind of lack of listening, the lack of connection, the divisiveness that we see with Brexit and in the US and across much of the world, actually. And traditionally, most embodiment practitioners have been very much on one side of the political spectrum. And in the same way as the vast majority of university lecturers from, social sciences, certainly on one side of the spectrum. And what's our role in healing something of this divide that we see? Because it's only going bad places.
Right. That's a really good question, and something I've spent a lot of time with, and it's kind of manifested in different ways. And of course, I certainly don't want to put myself on a pedestal and saying I'm above the fray. I mean, I get outraged, I get triggered, I get, all of this stuff. And part of me just wants to leave the fray. It's just like, I sometimes witness it all. It's like, oh my God, what is happening? And so there's a couple of things. One is, I think it is hard right now in terms of the scale of media and social media and what it is actually doing to our brains. I'm very concerned about that. And there's a guy named Tristan Harris who started something called the Center for Humane Technology. And he used to work for Google and Facebook. And he's really been looking at calling the industry to account for what's happening, how our attention is being channeled and diverted and exploited for gain. And so he's really calling out programmers to begin to think about how we can have an ethics and responsibility around that. I personally feel like most of us have been hijacked by our dependence on computers for at least the last 10 years, if not longer. But the evolution of consciousness for me right now is disturbing, because I think we can't really come to terms with what is happening between people until we look at the underlying conditions of not only how we've been imprisoned in specific roles and, in a sense, very functional roles to serve a larger system, which isn't really benefiting our lives and is really certainly not benefiting the planet. And, we have to really look at how is our consciousness being shaped by these tools that we rely on. Yes. And how is that, in a sense, generating more and more this discourse. I mean, we all know that fact of like looking at what somebody like writes on Facebook, complete stranger, and being outraged, and then people who get into like long back and forth conversations, with a total stranger who might be a bot. I mean, it has become so it's become so critical right now. What happens to space and time? And part of my mandate these days is actually inviting in more space. Part of like I say, I want to remove myself from the fray, but even just on a basic level, I know some people go to like 10-day Vipassana retreats. I actually prefer going for 10 days into the wilderness by myself. Mm-hmm. And just having that uncompressed time. And I think that's really important. Our relationships are not going to really change much until people give themselves more space and time to disconnect from everything that's being kind of ginned up.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there. Certainly space and time resonates with me as the sort of currency I have least of generally. It's like I've got enough money, I'm relatively healthy, but space and time, it's just like, God, my days can be so full. And, I've got no one else to blame but myself. I fill them up, and there's so many interesting things. It's so easy to fill up a bit of space with, I was walking along today and I thought, I'll listen to a podcast with Jamie to prepare to interview him. I filled up that bit of space, and it was like, and it was Brooks. So I thought, it's going to be a great podcast. And it was, on the one hand, it was enriching, but it meant that little half-hour window of just walking along Brighton, walking through Brighton didn't have to be, was filled up all of a sudden. The thinking time of just processing was taken out. And I celebrated one little decision I made today. Was I was walking to a yoga class, and I left the house in enough time that I would get there 10 minutes early. I wanted to meet the studio owner. I hadn't been there before. I wanted to settle in. I'd had an experience of sort of rushing to a class the day before, and it feeling so stupid rushing to yoga,
Right.
I just thought, this is retarded. I'm not going to. So today it was like, I was on a work call. I said, listen, Vidyadasa, was my colleague, I need to go now. And I made that 10-minute space that made the difference between walking in a relaxed way versus rushing, arriving in a relaxed way versus rushing. And it was a really smart choice. And I'm also sometimes curious why I don't make many more smarter choices like that. Make bits little, even those 10 minutes, let alone the 10 days in the wilderness. I mean, I do go on retreats, I do make holidays, but the last holiday I was at, I always had the sense that I was like running away. I was like escaping things. And there's this sort of pressure of the pressure of the busyness of one's own life, which is a very somatic thing. And I sometimes wake up, and if I have half an hour extra in bed, there's a panic, or there's a feeling of being behind the game. And in many ways, I think I'm very typical of the mod, despite being, the embodiment teacher with all these tools. I feel like I'm very typical for the modern age.
Right. And, there's a few things I want to kind of dovetail on that you said that I think are really important. One is, how do we all, and this is where our creativity comes in, how do we all generate our own practices? Like you said, the practice of, I'm going to give myself an extra 10 minutes so that I'm not rushing to get there. That is such a beautiful and profound practice, right? And and one of my pithy little sayings is, whatever we repeat is what we're actually learning and becoming, right? That's the way the nervous system works, is through repetition, right? So if I start making that practice, I'm going to give myself 10 minutes each day, a little more room in terms of showing up for an appointment, so I can actually stop for a moment and breathe if I want to. I can, look out on the horizon and take it in. I can smile at somebody. I can, so basic practice. How do we do that? And the other thing that I think is really important is we are saturated with so much input these days. And so I'm also looking at that. How much input am I ingesting? And then how much am I expressing? because I really do see it as this dual process, is that we take information in and then we channel it out through the motor system, through some action to, in a sense, find equilibrium. So if we're always ingesting, for me, it's kind of like binge eating, right? How do I metabolize this information? And it could be very conscious or, unconscious, in the sense of I might take in all this stuff and then I might move a little bit. I might notice how it impacts my body. I might kind of sing a bit. But how do we remember that the expressive body is part of our humanity? And I think that's really important, especially since, we can hear such great music all the time, or we can, just flip a switch and all of a sudden be entertained.
Yeah.
But what about our capacity to create? Back in the day, people had to make their own music, right? They had to sing out. They had to dance. We had to utilize our sensory motor system to give us aesthetic appreciation.
Yeah, we weren't just passive consumers quite often. There was often, if you go to a pub in Ireland, for example, it's quite common that someone will have a tin whistle or a fiddle, and it's part of the experience that you're actually
absolutely
creating. Yeah. And even if you're not the guy at the tin whistle, you're maybe just tapping the table for the rhythm,
right?
And it's participatory in that way. And I actually would say to listeners, because this is episode 162 or something crazy, 170, something like that.
Wow.
I know some of my listeners have been really like binging episodes, and we use this word binging like it wasn't problematic, like that's
right.
An unhealthy tendency, which we've somehow made into a sort of fun thing, like binge watching Netflix, I hear people say. And I would just really encourage listeners to, pause an episode halfway through to do what I'm doing now, which is standing up and moving around. And, it needs to be socially appropriate if you're on the tube or whatever, to talk about the episodes with other people, to listen to them twice, to just like to chew the meal. And and I'm going to say you're probably not going to listen to all of them. Unless you're hardcore, diehard fan, or, you drive a lot and you have a lot of time. Most people, it's like, don't worry about it. Just pick a few that the title jumps out at you. Trust they're the right ones and digest them, take time to chew on them rather than binge eat 100 and learn nothing.
Right. Right. And, it's that sense of, I think this is, it's really funny that what we're seeing, coming back to the world situation, what we're seeing is more and more kind of people splitting off and walls and fundamentalism and all of these kind of entrenchments of, and really what it represents for me is the need for boundaries. And how do we apply boundaries in our own life, in our own practice? So, for example, if I'm driving somewhere, I could talk on my phone, I could listen to music. And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm just actually going to drive and breathe and just use this as a time to just be with myself before I go into my next engagement. So because we have this abundance, like you say, of all these podcasts and all this information, it's like, okay, how am I going to create a boundary of space for me? How about if I feel that emptiness arising in me, I'm not going to pull out my cell phone and call somebody or, because let's face it, we are social beings. We are, in a sense, connected through time and space. So whatever is happening in culture is going to pull us along. And that, for me, is where I would say our discipline these days, and certainly my discipline, is how to individuate and separate out and join back together, to have that rhythm of not being swept up by these unconscious and clearly visible social forces that are pulling us all into this endless cycle of busyness and consumption, even if it's just information consumption.
Yeah, it's another kind of consumerism, isn't it? And sometimes listeners even sort of say guiltily to me when they meet me, they say, but I haven't listened to all of them yet. And I say, I expect you to. like, God, unless you're, you haven't got a job or you've had some unusual circumstance, it's very unlikely. But listeners, I just reassure you, you don't have to tick all them off, It's okay. Even my favourite podcasts, I haven't heard them all. That's why I hadn't heard you on Brooke Thomas, actually. It's one of my favourite podcasts. It's interesting.
So, can I say one more thing that I miss kind of seeing you in conversation right now, but it was interesting when you mentioned this thing about how at a certain point as we're talking, you got up and moved around. And that's what I just want to kind of just put a pin on that in terms of this is what I've discovered about teaching online. And I think that a lot of more and more teachers will be utilizing as we go forward is the beauty of people being in their own spaces and being able to respond to the information as I'm guiding a practice, that because they have their sound off and their camera off, they can relate to the information however they want without the old ideas. Am I getting it right or wrong? Oh, if I make a sound while I bother somebody else, the social pressure or, all of these things that happen to us in collective situations. So there's always this with everything, a trade-off, right? In a live room of people, there's a certain energy exchange and community that's awesome. And in terms, for me, because I always come back to that I'm really at heart a teacher. I want to share resources for people to learn that they can then use and apply however they want. And that what I find as a teacher, when people learn in the comfort and safety of their own homes without, any perceived outer judgments, that then they can settle into material in a different way. And because home for many of us is where we start from as our practice point, that the material can, in a sense, be metabolized so much easier. And so that's really one thing I've learned from teaching online that I think is really awesome. And I'm so excited about it because I think that this will happen more and more in the future. But I love the idea that here are some guideposts for your practice. Now, however you want to relate to this is up to you, right? Yeah. Some of us have more needs for stillness. Some of us have more needs for movement. But we can all share a common focus and then see where it takes us.
Yeah, so, there's 2 points here. I think, this idea of the benefits of online home practice, because people can be quite snobby about this. And, we found at the Embodiment conference last year that people went really deep, particularly in the breakout rooms with each other. And I think one factor is people feel really safe because you're in your own home. It's familiar, you're comfortable. You haven't just got off a plane. You're not staying in some shitty hotel. We've been kept awake all night. You haven't had to eat food you don't really like to eat, because that's all you could get at lunch. You've cuddled your wife or your husband maybe in the morning, and you're there, and no one can get at you. You can turn the screen off, the camera off if you don't want to be seen. So you're not constantly on show. And I know many of us, particularly women that I've talked to, feel constantly on show. And you can interact in a safe way. Literally, no one can physically hurt you. If you've got an abuse background and you're worried about, other people, maybe people have had, sexual assault experiences or whatever, you can't do that through a computer screen. So it's less easily. So there is a way in which people just feel safer and happier in those environments. And as you say, the other thing is the learning transfer. If you're not learning it for your life, where the fuck are you learning it for?
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing is, because, we always used to talk about state-dependent learning, right?
Yeah.
So you go away to a workshop, but then you come home. How do you translate the experience you had out there back into your daily life? And for me, that's really fundamental. And I would say that that's also been, one of the things I've really harvested from all the different, trauma studies work I've been exposed to is until we feel safe, it is hard to, in a sense, let down the hypervigilant borders that inhibit us from taking in information, especially nourishment. So safety is fundamental to really effectively learning, these new skills that all of us want to offer. So that is a very important aspect of, for me, how do we move forward with safety, and how do we teach people to somatically sensate, feel safety, right? So
yeah, makes sense. And we'll come back to what you're saying about the technology earlier. There's always this gap I've noticed in human culture, if you study history, between the technology and then people choosing how to use it wisely. Like factories were invented, and then sort of 50 years later, maybe people went, well, hang on a minute, do we really want children working in them? Do we need to avoid industrial accidents? And I feel like in the modern technology age, we're in a similar position that factories are at. Factories were maybe destroying people's bodies. They were polluting people, toxics, and there was, people getting their hands cut off in the Black Country in England and all this. And then eventually that got sorted out. So now if you go to a factory in Birmingham, it's a hell of a lot safer place to be than in the 18th century, And I wonder if, information technology is in a similar stage. People are just starting to go, hang on a minute.
Right.
And I love that we've just spoken to the benefits of online learning, because we're not being sort of reactionary Luddites here.
Right.
We're saying, look, this is great. This has got some real advantages, like scale would be another advantage, like actually making this stuff affordable to people.
Right. Absolutely.
The elitism of something like Alexander Technique, and there's people out there who are trying to change that. But, the scalability of it is real advantages. And then I think maybe the embodiment crowd are some of the first to wake up to this. Like some of my friends have gone off Facebook, or I've taken email off my phone, for example, making little changes in our kind of behavioral architecture. And I wonder if the embodiment people are going to be some of the first, because we're a little bit more, hopefully, a little bit more tuned in to ourselves. Now, like, do I feel good after I've been on Facebook for an hour?
Right.
Probably not. And, as an embodiment person, I hope I'm at least feeling that.
Exactly. So, tuning in and taking those momentary pauses of what is arising in me, how do I sense myself, how does this interface with what I want or need, is really an important foundation. And I would say for myself, part of our decision to live rurally is, for me, living with the land, living with a piece of land that I get to watch and nurture and steward. And that, for me, in a way, it is like a art practice. It's a practice of, this is life, when I really strip away all of these things that we've been, in a sense, enculturated to believe in, and to actually be with plant and tree and cycles of life. For me, that is in a sense, the somatic counterpart expressed in how the planet gives me that sense of perspective and overview, and just really becoming part of that rhythm. It's how I kind of maintain my personal sanity, but also my connection to something that's much larger and feels significant. This is how human beings have lived for centuries and centuries and centuries. We are part of this planet, not separate from it. And so, I really choose to live that reality. And it's one of the things I like to share in my work with people, is that frequency and really the aesthetic of life on this planet.
Nice. I want to come back to something earlier you were talking about stillness. And in an earlier interview I heard with you, you were sort of saying that you've made some changes, as it were, from kind of traditional mindfulness, and even the traditional mindfulness might not be suited to this modern hectic pace of life or technology kind of brains we find ourselves in. I think that was a really interesting point that I've heard very few people make, that was essentially sort of using medieval Asian technology.
Right.
Is that smart anymore?
So would you be willing to share some of your thoughts on that, Jamie?
Sure. Well, once again, what studying a little bit about trauma has revealed to me is like, if so much is going on, especially with the pace of cultures, so much is going on, it's easy to avoid, right, our inner experience, right? So much of culture's demanding outer focus. So all of a sudden it's like, I've heard meditation is good for me. I'm going to go and meditate. So I close my eyes and the instruction I'm given is, pay attention to the movement of your breath in your belly. That's right. Talk about like all of a sudden just like throwing somebody into the pool and saying, okay, now swim. So we know that can be terrifying for a lot of people. Yeah. So I thought, okay, how to take, in a sense, this wisdom of the past and update it to the conditions of the present moment. We know that the mind is going so fast, so how to slow it down? Well, one of the things I learned over the years from Emily Conrad was the use of sound. So even making, a sound like this, a breathy breath, not only can I hear the sound, but if I also put my hands on my body, I can sense that condensing of the muscles in my torso, making that sound happen. So I have multiple focuses. And by having multiple focuses, it takes the overactive brain and directs it into these sensory channels. So one aspect of, for me, updating mindfulness practice is utilizing multiple channels of somatic experience. If I can feel it, if I can hear it, if I can sense it, right? If I can track it in my mind's eye, for example, as I'm making that sound, and my hands are on my belly and I'm feeling the condensing of my belly towards my spine, and I'm simultaneously sinking a little bit further back into my chair. I might be moving a tiny little bit, and then on the inhale, I come forward a little bit, and I can feel my hands expanding outwards as my belly expands. So you kind of get the point that by inviting in multiple points of focus that are what I'd like to call this is not multitasking, this is somatic orchestration of pieces. And because the brain needs something to do, to have these multiple focuses allows the body to settle. And as the body settles, the mind can settle. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is, I always like to say, and this has been borne out by research, that 15 minutes of contemplative practice basically does the same thing to the gray matter of the brain as 40 minutes of practice. So once again, let's get out of the rigidity of our ideas about, if I don't meditate for 40 minutes, I'm not doing it right. And well, it's getting harder and harder to do 40 minutes of practice. So I guess meditation is just not for me, blah, 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 right? Yeah. It's like, no, just scale it to fit your life. Yeah. What's more important is the daily repetition, because ultimately it's like a form of weight training. You are building a muscle, and this muscle is really needed to buffer us from the overstimulation of modern life. So those are just a few of my ideas about how we can take these ideas, but like really realize, these are our current conditions. Okay.
I think our current conditions are faster and more complex, and our brains have changed, Right. Really track those differences in my own brain over even the last 10 years, let alone, people that are growing up with this. I think it's one reason yoga is so popular, because it's kind of complicated and it gives people something to focus on. And for me, I had to do quite a lot of martial arts before I could even sit still and meditate. I just couldn't do it. It was impossible for me. And by couldn't do it, I don't mean there was some mental chatter. I mean, it was unbearable for me. And by the time I'd done 10 years of martial arts, it was like, okay, I was calming down, physiologically there were changes. And then I was able to sit. And multiple channels make sense if we're used to lots of things happening.
Right.
And making it interesting in that way, which for for someone who was a rice farmer in ancient India, they just didn't have so much stuff going on. They didn't have so much stimulation.
Right. Well, we lived in a different frequency and tempo. And I think that's part of the thing. And this is how, I always come back to the body. It's like, well, how does the body work? And how does the body work in relationship to culture? And there was a thing I discovered many years ago that made so much sense to me. A guy named Randall McClellan wrote a book about the healing power of music. And one of the things he said, which really caught my attention, he said, when you look at, different cultures, the Eastern contemplative cultures drew in their practices. And in a sense, they used the drone sound in music, right? Which is very much like the parasympathetic nervous system, that drone, that long sustained ooh. Whereas the trance dance cultures used, the drumming to, in a sense, amp up the system and really focus on the pulse, and the pulse taking them over into this altered state. So the expression bum 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 bum, bum, shamanic cultures, drumming cultures, the emphasis went out. And I thought, well, that's really like the autonomic nervous system, that sometimes to really deeply settle, we have to amp up the system, right? So some people can access that stillness after amping up, whereas other people can dive in. And how do we then, in a sense, play with those two polarities to really find balance in the system? Because that's ultimately, for me, what it's all about, right? Some of us need more movement activity before we can settle. Some people need less. And it's like, how do we honor the full range of our individuality while creating collective experiences that mirror how nature, in a sense, really formed us as human animals?
Very nice, very nice. So, Jamie, we need to be moving towards a wrap up relatively soon, no mad rush. Anything you're sort of super passionate about at the moment, anything you want to talk about from your past or your present that you feel like we haven't covered that you might want to? It's a bit of a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, right?
Are there words you want to say? If that's too big, go on.
I think that, I was actually, so many things are going through my brain, but something that just, struck me is I was having lunch a couple of months ago with Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, and we were talking about, and I was really quite distressed in that moment about what's happened with climate change and how can I participate in this larger movement to make a difference. I'm very inspired by people like Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement. And, I'm 64 now, and I really want to support youth movements and the energy of youth movements to coalesce in really mass action to claim their place at the table. And so, I've been working with different forms of that, but when we were having lunch, I was just kind of, I'd gone to this gathering, and it was just like, it was very distressing to me. And she lovingly reminded me that our role is really, in a sense, that what we've, kind of cultivated over many years is really inviting people into their physicality. And I love the way she said it. We really are, bringing people into their physicality. And she said, we both have been mentors for a long time, and that's how we really serve what is happening. And so it just gave me a moment to pause and realize that, yes, I have a lot of interests. I have a lot of, different things I can do. And, one of the ways that I'm, kind of doing that through my artwork is through these videos I've put on YouTube, what I call the breathing room series, of just these slow dissolves of my images from the natural world with music to basically, slow people down and drop them down while having their eyes open, right? Because so much of contemplative practice can be drawing inwards, but how can we also be in our breath and sensation and, in a sense, have an outer focus?
Mm-hmm.
So, but coming back to this idea that, mentorship, that feels really true and important. And to keep reminding myself of that, I'd say, central line that's been running through my life for the last 40 years, which is how to explore and express the living, exciting, really unknown body that we inhabit, right? There is still the body of mystery, and that mystery is revealed through our participation in somatic experience. So how to mentor, and at the same time, how also to, once again, use technology as a way to amplify what we're doing out in the world, with generosity, with heart, with spirit, and really for me with gratitude for this crazy, beautiful life we live in.
Jamie, I think that's a beautiful place to wrap it up. Eloquently put. Thank you. If people can want to find you, they can find you at somaticexpression.com, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Great.
And naturebeingart.org.
I didn't find that one. Nature Being Art. I'm literally typing this in now to make sure it goes on the wingart.org. There we are. Naturebeingart.org. I see all the photography. Beautiful. Okay, and those YouTube videos I just brought up, and they look quite special, so I'd point people to those. And Jamie, final message about the body for our listeners. Parting message.
I guess it really comes back to one of my great spiritual teachers is a writer named Wendell Berry. I'd say a lot of my spiritual teachers are poets and writers. And one of the things he said that for me is so true about both planet and body is that we know enough of our own history that we will exploit that which we find to be of value, but we will defend what we love. And for me, I'd say if there's anything, it's like loving this body, nurturing this body, and loving the earth, having this mutuality and reciprocity between body and earth gives me, and hopefully gives all of us, the stamina to really stand up and defend this that we love. This is our mandate for now.
Jamie, you're a beautiful man. Thank you so much for your time today. Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy.
And of course, is our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook. There, bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.